Welcome to Fragmented, a software developer podcast where we talk about building good software and becoming better developers. My name's Don Felker.
And I'm Kaushik Gopal.
Welcome to the show. It's the end of 2020 almost, Kaushik. Seems like the year that never ends, but it's getting close.
Yeah, we're almost there. It's, October, 2 more months, and hopefully all of the nightmares that we're seeing today should come to an end.
True, but that's exciting. But even what's more exciting is actually being able to talk about a topic that I'm passionate about and you're very passionate about.
Yeah.
And that's testing. And so you actually found someone that we've kind of known for a little bit in the community and invited them to on the show. Now, I was wondering if you might be able to introduce who you were bringing on the show, and we can start chatting. Absolutely.
So it's funny. Literally, episode 1 was about Android testing, and now we are on 201. So I feel like it's time to do a State of the Union with testing to see how far we have come.
Indeed.
And I think we have found like the perfect guest. So without further ado, I would like to bring in Valera. How's it going, Valera?
Hey, Kaushik and Don. How are you?
Pretty good.
Doing well. Thanks for coming on the show. I really appreciate it.
I appreciate you inviting me.
Yeah, for sure. So as we usually like to do here on the show, for folks that maybe are not familiar with who you are and what you've done, if you could kind of give a brief overview of your history with Android, maybe kind of where you have worked, and kind of just bring us up current about a little bit of background information about you so we can have some familiarity between all of us and the listeners.
Sure. I can start maybe backwards, as usually how I do it. I'm currently a tech lead or the tech lead of the mobile developer experience team at Slack. This team actually covers both of the mobile platforms, so iOS and Android. And I've been at Slack for around 4.5 years. Time flies. Prior to that, I was on a brief sabbatical, and then prior to that, I worked at Google for 4.5 years, or actually 3.5, sorry. And at Google, I joined to work on the Google Wallet at the time.
Oh, wow.
It was called Google Wallet. This was a startup.
Damn.
Kind of within Google. And later that morphed into what we now know as Android Pay. Is it still called Android Pay, by the way? They keep changing the name. Maybe Google Pay now.
Google Pay now, right? Yeah.
Yes. Okay. You see, I've lost track. But out of that project, this was the kind of maybe not the early days of Android, but still fairly early. I believe when I joined, the latest version of Android was Gingerbread. As you remember, testing was in a bit of shambles, and I was a software engineer in test. So my mission was to provide testing support for the developers that were developing Google Wallet, we quickly realized the team that was working on it that we're going to have to do a lot of work there, and I just happened to really luck out and work with a brilliant tech lead, a guy named Tom Kinch, and also just really a small team of very good engineers, and out of that we decided that we would really like to start building tools for testing. Everyone was dealing with the same kind of problems at the time for everybody, at least at Google, not just for Google Wallet, but for all the other Google apps. And so we formed a small team and we started developing those tools. And some of them that you may have heard of are Espresso. There's also Project Nitrogen, which, by the way, hasn't launched, but at Google that existed since about 2012, I think. So that's kind of like some of the infrastructure that our team built, to enable all of the Google engineers to do mobile Android development. And then we, of course, realized that there is a lot of demand for these tools externally. So we started releasing some of them to the wider Android community. So that's kind of my story with Android and with Android testing tools.
That is crazy. That's awesome. I it's funny to like see the other side of the chapter, because I remember Don and I were very famous about complaining, because both of us are big. We're very big into testing. From like the last 200 episodes, people would notice. But it's nice to see that, like, on the other side of the aisle, there were folks who cared about this with as much sort of fervor.
Yeah.
But also, it's a testament to see like some of the tools that have come out. Like, Espresso has changed the game. It's like fair to say that in Android development, Espresso gray box testing has like been a boon for most developers who have at least had some inclination of doing some level of UI testing.
Yeah, I'm really happy to hear that. Part of the reason why I actually was curious about joining Slack and becoming I was a feature developer for a brief period of time is because when I was working on Espresso, on developing Espresso within Google, we had a test application that we tested Espresso with, but I never really fully developed features and tested those features with Espresso. And I always, in the back of my mind, I could see that the framework was popular. In the back of my mind, I always had doubts: does this thing really actually work as we intended it, as we promised it would work? And I think that when I joined Slack and I wrote my first Espresso test that tested a feature that I wrote, I was able to set it up in a way that it was actually a reliable test. It didn't work out of the box, so there were some caveats that we had to address. But I was happy to see that it actually did sort of mostly deliver on the vision.
I mean, it's funny. I actually even remember the first time I think I met you was at a Google I/O. I can't remember which Google I/O right now, but I remember this was like, just after you had probably left Google. Mm-hmm. And in one of those state of the, I forget what they call it, the fireside
chat.
Yeah. You came up to the mic and you were like, oh, we need like Google to do more about Espresso. And I was like, wait, isn't that also the dude who also built Espresso? And I was like, what is happening here? So I had a moment, and it's only, I think, after that like, yeah, we met up and chatted. So It's nice to see the whole story come around.
Mm-hmm.
So I guess one of the reasons we wanted to talk to you specifically now is you have seen full circle how, like, it is building the testing framework and, building the testing framework for Android. And now you're on the other side where you're using these frameworks. Mm-hmm. And so we thought it would make a lot of sense to ask you, like, where do you think, in your opinion, because you clearly have a lot of experience testing, and also like now that at Slack you see it for both iOS and Android, so mobile in general, what exactly, what is your opinion about where testing stands today for Android development, right? And, do you think it makes sense? It's easy to test? Do you think more developers should be testing? There's no reason we shouldn't be. Are there any tools missing? Like, just give us like the initial download of what you think where testing stands today for Android development.
Sure, yeah. I've been thinking about this a lot lately, and especially I like the fact that you pointed out that I work on both platforms. I can really see the differences, and just TLDR, Android is years ahead of iOS at this point in time, and there's several reasons for that. So I like this analogy that I came up with recently. Of course, I like it. I came up with it. If you think about testing at scale, and it doesn't have to be a huge scale. Our scale is not huge. We only have one application, but we still have quite a number of tests, and we want to run them frequently. If you're writing tests, you want to run them, right? The system, the problem of having the entire system be reliable, to me, it looks very similar to how modern data centers are built, where there is it used to be, I guess, commodity hardware, and it's known that each individual unit can fail. And the system is built around the fact that, that unit can be sort of taken out and managed separately, and it's not going to impact the overall reliability of the system. So I think I'm thinking about this problem a lot right now, because on iOS, we still cannot reliably run our PR checks, whereas on Android we can. I started thinking, why is that? So what kind of precursors do you need in order for this to happen? And it's a lot more than just about authoring the tests. And authoring the tests is very important. And you do need a framework that allows you to author reliable tests. you also need an app architecture that supports reliable testing that allows you to isolate components and so forth and so on. We kind of wrote a blog post that tries to address at least part of that issue. Setting up kind of your application state, is a critical part of reliable testing, of authoring reliable tests. But then here's the thing that really differentiates Android from iOS, is the ability to run tests at scale and to run them in an isolated way. If we talk about unit testing, then things are maybe roughly similar, JVM versus kind of your Swift tests that run against a simulator. Although, for example, you still do need a simulator most of the time to run Swift tests unless you do some hacking.
Yeah, that's the other thing that I noticed recently when I was working on some iOS. Again, like to give some more history, like I remember I had talked to Xavi in the early days of Android, and I used to complain a lot about this. I was like, why do I need to like spin up a whole JVM? Like, these are just unit tests. They should just run like super fast, right? And it's odd to see that today in Android, that's totally possible. Like, our unit tests run like significantly faster because you're not spinning up anything, right, in emulator or a simulator. But the flip side is also like the thing is because it is a simulator on iOS, it's not that bad either. It is definitely slower than our unit tests, but it's not that bad, right? Or do you feel like...
Yeah, the performance overhead is not nearly as high as for the Android emulator. So I think, there is definitely... they have less of an incentive to move off of the simulator. I don't think it's a big deal. But where I was going to say, the big differentiator is the ability to run instrumentation or on-device tests, let's call them that, in an isolated fashion and at scale. So I think actually the Android Orchestrator is kind of maybe not widely understood piece of infrastructure. But I think it's super critical if you want to have lots of tests and run them frequently.
Can you talk a little about that? Because you mentioned some very interesting terms. So
what is it?
Yeah, so the Android Orchestrator is a component that essentially guarantees that every instrumentation test, when you turn on Orchestrator, is executed in its own process. And this came out of an observation that we made when we were writing infrastructure that runs all of the tests at Google, which is millions and millions of tests. So you see these maybe less frequent occurrences of flakiness that you would maybe not normally see in other companies. Again, Tom Kinch, our tech lead, noticed that there's a lot of statefulness around Android processes that run on Android. And so with one very easy one, of course, if a test crashes, then the entire process goes down, and then the remainder of the tests don't finish. So that's kind of an easy one. But then there's other, I think, more tricky things where state builds up and can impact downstream tests. And so at that point, he kind of said that, and this is especially true, I believe, of when you launch the Android application. So when you're launching and doing UI testing. And at that point, it became clear that we need some sort of process level isolation where every single test method is launched in its own process. So, to put it in very practical terms, that's the ADB shell AM instrument command for every single test method versus ADB shell AM instrument command for just say a test class or the entire test suite. And there, the thing is that when you do it this way, you're paying a pretty significant performance penalty. Essentially, you're paying the penalty of cold start for your application. So it does incentivize you to reduce your cold start time also. And this penalty is significant, but it really, really gives you much higher reliability when you're running your instrumentation tests. So how do you deal with that penalty? You deal with that by essentially scaling horizontally and running your test suite across many, many different devices. And that's simply, on iOS, this is a really difficult problem to solve right now. There is no equivalent of Firebase Test Lab virtual devices that are cheap and plentiful, or unlimited for our sakes and purposes. And on Android, all of these kind of pieces of infrastructure exist, and therefore it is easier to sort of manage a large Android test suite.
This process that you called is also basically what they call sharding, right? Like test sharding in some fashion.
Yes, parallelization sharding. Yep. Yeah, and the tool that we use that I will recommend to almost everyone looking at sharding and parallelizing their testing is Flank. So it's a project by, I believe, Matt Edwards, and it's written in Kotlin. It's modern code base, actively maintained by several maintainers. They fix bugs quickly and add features. It's been a very solid piece of infrastructure that I'm glad we adopted.
If anyone's interested and they want to learn more about it, on episode 163, we talked about Flank with Matt Runo from American Express. So if anyone wants to know more about it.
That's right. That's awesome. So you mentioned the orchestrator portion, and what you're saying is something like this does not exist on iOS. So if I was an iOS developer today, because these days, like from the podcast, we also get like listeners from both ends. So I'm curious. It's we should run down the tools for Android that, like, if you were to start like a brand new application and you want the best of the best, what would Valera use on an Android application? We definitely want to run through that list. But before we get to that point, on the iOS side, so is there basically no solution? It's just like spin up one simulator and just run through all the tests one after the other. Is that currently the solution, or are you exploring different things there?
So there are some open source projects, and we've adopted one of them. There's a project called Blue Pill. This is an open source project from LinkedIn. This is not the equivalent of Orchestrator. It's it's a test runner. It's more of the equivalent of Flank. But it's a test runner that parallelizes tests across simulators, but does it locally on a machine. It doesn't do any remote parallelization like Flank does. It's I think it's a fairly solid piece of infrastructure, and LinkedIn actively maintains it, and they actually have they do iOS testing at scale. But it does not currently have this process level isolation for every test method. I talked to the authors of that tool, and they said that the performance penalty, they think would be too high in order to do that. And I agree with them that in this, when you do it this way, you cannot parallelize within a single machine. You have to parallelize sort of remotely across many different machines. I've talked to companies that have good iOS testing stories. So I believe Pinterest has built something similar to Orchestrator, where they do parallelize across many different remote machines. Their test suite. I'm not sure whether they run their test suite as a PR check, so they may not run it as frequently. And this is just something that they had to, build by hand. So it is not easy. You're really kind of there's nothing that would just give you that out of the box.
And you mentioned PR checks. So just for listeners who want to understand, this is basically if you use Git or GitHub and you have a PR up, you basically aren't allowed to, there are certain checks that are run on this PR. And so that's what you mean by PR checks, right? So in this case, run all your tests. And if your tests pass, then your check passes or something.
Yeah, I'm a big believer in blocking sort of PR checks that don't allow you to merge if all the tests don't pass.
Yeah, we do the same too. And like, I think we will cover this in this episode basically, but like, I think a large part of the problem then is flaky tests, because if you have flaky tests and you have build blockers, you can have a very angry mobile team.
Yes.
But yeah, that's why you gotta avoid the flaky tests.
It's probably one of the main things that my team works on at Slack, and we'll probably continue working on that for a while.
So I guess we were talking about the list of different tools for Android. So can you like run us down, like what do you think is an ideal setup for anyone who wants to like really get, and I understand this is going to differ between like large companies and smaller and like, indie developers. But yeah, in your opinion, what is a good set of tools for any Android developer to be testing today?
It's an interesting question. I haven't thought about it for a long time, and I will caveat this with the fact that I haven't really done Android development, kind of feature development in a while. So I can talk about what we have at Slack maybe and start there.
Yeah.
I think we didn't really try to kind of reinvent the wheel here or anything like that. As I said, when I arrived, I wrote the first espresso test that we had. And thankfully, the application architecture was already set up. It had Dagger, so we could, it was easy to swap out components and set up test state. And I would say that what I would recommend is focusing more on your application architecture, actually, and also the test architecture, and making sure that you can easily set up in a maintainable way, set up test state. We presented on a pattern, I think at one of the DroidCons a while back, with a colleague of mine called PowerPack. It's something that we call PowerPack just because, robots, PowerPack go together.
Clearly.
And yeah. And I think this has actually bought us a lot of test sort of maintenance and stability on Android, and also we now have written one for iOS. But essentially, this is a layer of abstraction that allows you to quickly set up the layer of your application that is specific to your application. So, for example, for Slack, that would be, I want the application to start with 3 channels and 5 users, and I want the status to be sent to blah, blah. So just something that is very descriptive, very easy to kind of express in a declarative way. And then behind the scenes, that framework, kind of that layer, handles setting up, swapping out all of your dependencies in a thread-safe way, and just sort of guarantees that it can hook up everything correctly, that your application can launch in a sane state. That, I think, has been probably the single biggest lever that we've had for authoring reliable tests.
That's interesting, because usually when you ask folks like, oh, how do you write like good tests? Like usually good architecture is almost like, yeah, they assume it, but they don't call it out. So it's nice that you're calling it out. And you're saying specifically things like Dagger that help with dependency injection, like are good to be using in order to get testing. Is that the idea?
Yeah, I think this is a strong belief of mine, and also the testing is not only is it good for catching regressions, it is a good tool for that, but it's also a very important tool for forcing you to write good code. And so when you start with the problem statement that I would like to have reliable tests that are easy to author in my code base, that actually is a natural forcing function for a lot of decisions that you can make. So you then need to start thinking about layers of your architecture, how you can swap out those layers during testing, and how maybe you can do some think about thread safety. So, for example, making sure that all of your data is immutable. And also that you can maybe switch out your tests to run on a single thread with your app. So all of these architectural decisions then just come in, and they naturally, I think, force you to make the correct decisions if you want to have reliable, fast tests. So I think that's why I'm a big advocate for developers also owning testing. The testing is not just for regression; it's really a development tool.
The question I have, I think a lot of people are going to have that are listeners of the show, is they may be interested in testing. They have an application, and maybe they're in a very similar situation that you were in when you joined Slack, is that there was no test there. If you have mentioned a few things, like make sure proper layering, maybe dependency injection and stuff like that. But if you had to consult someone asking you right now, hey, I have an application, I don't have any tests, what's kind of maybe the general guideline that you would recommend for someone to kind of start with so they can make their application more testable? Or maybe it's just a complete mess and they want to get to that state. What would you recommend? Would it be, make sure you have dependency injection, make sure you're using this type of layering? Do you have a prescription that you might be able to provide, or just a couple of recommendations?
Yeah, I think if people want the blog post that I mentioned, this is on the Slack engineering blog, kind of goes into most of the stuff in detail. But I think the important layering is, so anything that really here's how I would start, and this is exactly how I started. I wrote a simple espresso test that launched the settings screen of your application. Most applications have a settings screen. The settings screen is usually behind the login. And so when you start writing this test, you think, okay, this is going to work, and you just launch it, and you see the login screen. And then you start saying, oh, what launches that login screen? How do I actually get to the settings screen directly without having to go through the login process? Then you start digging through the dependency injection graph, if you have one. Well, you always have one. And you start saying, oh, this component is what's launching the screen. So how can I swap out this component and make it believe that we are in a logged in state? So then you swap that out. If hopefully you have Dagger already, and it's or some sort of dependency injection, and it's easy to do so. So you set up the sort of that dependency and configure it properly, and then you hit the next blocker. That maybe my screen has no data. And then you start thinking, well, okay, how do I populate the data? Without actually manually enter it as a user. And so then you're starting to look at the data layer, and maybe your data comes from a database. And of course, one simple thing you could do is just place a database on the disk. But I would recommend going one layer above, and whatever is reading from the database and swapping out that layer. So we have a layer of what we call repository layer or data providers. They have different names, and so then you end up setting up that state. And actually, a lot of state setup happens kind of in more modern applications happens at that level. Then you might hit some APIs, and you might see, oh, like this screen is failing because this API call happened, and it didn't return. By the way, another thing I would recommend doing is shutting off internet on your emulator when you're doing this, so that you could actually make sure that your test is hermetic and is not reaching out, not depending on network state. And so you're going to just hit all these different cases until you finally manage to set up all your dependencies in a way that launches that screen directly and makes it show you the data that it wants. And then from there, I think it's actually very straightforward to use Espresso to just manipulate a few, the settings or check things on the screen. So really, I think the most work happens at the level of setting up.
Yeah.
And then you do this for a couple screens. You're going to notice certain patterns. You're going to notice, I'm always, setting up this class. And doing this thing, and you're going to start seeing duplicate code. And at that point, I would recommend that you start thinking about a new layer of abstraction and kind of hiding all of that difficult test setup in some sort of an API, what we call PowerPack. So that's kind of my recommendation. Very hands-on, kind of pragmatic way.
Excellent. Yeah, definitely a lot of steps involved. I've felt the same exact situations that you've recommended many times, just starting with that one simple screen, and like as you said, you kind of rewind from there. It's like, all right, well, how do I even get to launch the screen? Where does that data come from? Okay, and you kind of have to solve each one of those problems before you can kind of get to a more stable environment. So very good. Thank you.
I had a quick follow-up to one thing you said, and this is you mentioned, and this is like before you mentioned the PowerPack bits. You said like, you want to write good tests, make them descriptive. What are like some tools that you've used to write descriptive tests? Because this is like one of those things where you can get into like a testing argument forever. Like it's one of those never-ending discussions. But in your opinion, how do you define like a good descriptive test? I
think I'll just go directly to say that I think we don't need to reinvent the wheel here. And the robot pattern, which I believe Jake first brought to Android, and that comes from the page object pattern in web testing. I think that gives you essentially, you want to separate out the what from the how, and I think this was in Jake's presentation. That's kind of like what PowerPack is doing on the side of setting up test state, is setting up the what, hiding the how behind an interface, which is the what. So your test should just be kind of saying, they should read easily. You should be able to read it in a almost like a manual testing script, right? So it's saying, given that I have 3 channels and 5 users, click. Well, you don't want to say click on this button. You want to say switch channels, for example, or send a direct message to this user. I'm using Slack lingo because that's what I know. So you want to express your test in that way, and then how you do that is expressed already in kind of the underlying, espresso kind of on view interactions. So that's what I would recommend. At Slack, we wrote a bunch of these robots for our end-to-end tests, and developers have started using them for regular instrumentation, sort of regular, what I would call UI unit tests.
Oh, nice.
And it's a nice layer of abstraction that helps you, first of all, just have much better, more readable tests, but also, again, there's this concept of shared code, and kind of everyone maintains the robots, and it's easier to say if there's a systemic error that you need to fix, it's easier to fix it in one place than go all over and have to modify a bunch of different tests.
Yeah. I mean, the one thing that I've personally found extremely helpful, especially like with a lot of the engineers that I work, I always tell them, like, look, I know it seems sometimes like a drag, but it's really important, like, the whole BDD style thing, right? Where, given XXX, when XXX, YYY, then, ZZZ.
Yeah.
Even like, I think just forcing yourself, because if you've never done this, it's really hard the first time, because typically what would happen in the early days of my testing, I would just say, test this method, or just, it's like how people write git commits, where like, the commit log just has like a bunch of garbage, right? They're like, oh, whatever, test this method, test that method. And that's like, it's better than nothing in the early days, but that's like so far from where you want to be, right? And like this robot pattern that you mentioned is also like a good one. The BDD style thing, where I'm like, it doesn't matter, like any test you write can be worded in that fashion. And what you'll notice is sometimes when it gets extremely hard to word your test in that fashion, you're probably not writing the test that you should be writing, right? You're writing more of those how tests versus the what tests, and you want to be focusing on the what tests, right? Because in the end, you don't necessarily care that much about what happens in the innards. You only care about the inputs and the outputs.
Yeah. I think those are all good points. Yeah. I'll agree with you.
Usually when we talk about testing, I think the big thing that comes about is like TDD, right? Do you have any opinions on TDD? Should we be doing TDD? Is it even possible for mobile testing? Is it worth it? What are your opinions there?
I think that it's possible. I also believe that it's worth it. And I will also admit that I don't always do it myself. So it's kind of hard to I do really try hard to do that, and when I do it, I'm always happy that I did it. Let's put it that way. So I have to overcome some sort of resistance, because, of course, the urge is to just go and write the code first, and then I think there's almost this fear. It's like, oh, is my code going to work? And I just need to like get this down into my code really quickly before I forget it, or something like that, at least for me. But I think that, starting, if you know that this code is going to live for a long time, and it's not prototype throwaway code, I think that starting with tests is a good place to start. I cannot say that I'm an expert on TDD, though, that I really systematically follow this sort of like write one test and write some code to make it work. I have experimented with it a few times, and I think every single time I did it, I liked it. It's almost like, for example, that I think it's a similar problem to when you're doing some kind of a manual process, and you can probably get it done in like 5 minutes, but you could also write a script. It's going to take you a little bit longer. I also sometimes think about that, and sometimes I just say, okay, I'm just going to do it because I'm only doing it once, but then invariably I end up doing it many times, and I regret that I didn't write that script to automate it. And so I think maybe also with TDD there's something similar, where if you have that test and you can kind of quickly and continuously iterate by running these tests, I think it's a really nice way to work. And it's again, I'll come back to this, that I heard this from another talk, where TDD is just a natural forcing function for writing clean code. So I think that I really buy into. So I wouldn't say like I wouldn't force developers to really, really strictly follow TDD, but I definitely would say at the level of a PR of when you're submitting a change and you want to merge it into mainline, then this is you absolutely must have all the tests there. So at that level, I am sort of testing must be there when you're merging anything into mainline, but at the level of actually sitting at your IDE and writing the code, I wouldn't say I wouldn't go that far
That's
for
right.
to force everyone to do it. Yeah.
Don, I'm curious. I know you also like have been a big TDD person in the past. Yeah, well, what are your thoughts there?
Similar. I'm self-admittedly I don't do TDD all the time. I think there's a misconception about TDD where you have to do TDD all the time, otherwise you're not doing it. And I'm sure there'll be people that argue that. But my problem with it is sometimes I don't know what I need to test. And I feel that to do TDD effectively, you kind of have to know where you're going already. And then at that point, you can kind of start driving the test. And there's different layers too. So I may know that I may start at a high level, like an espresso level test, a UI test. All right, well, I know this thing needs to be on the screen, and I'm just going to write a test for that, and then I can go implement it. I find value in that, but if I don't know what I don't know yet, maybe I'm using a new API and I want to test it, well, I can't even write a test for it if I don't know what I'm doing. So I will follow it if I'm very kind of clear on where I'm going, but if I don't, then I'll kind of spike out some code, test it out, then come back, write a test, and kind of do it a little bit backwards. But I do believe that testing should be required for a lot of the major features that people put out there. But what about you? How do you handle it?
Very similar, I feel, like to what you folks are saying, right? For me, when I'm just starting off the feature, I actually don't write my tests right away. I like try to play with the code and see where I'm going. And maybe that's like, it is what Valera was saying. Maybe that's just my fear of wanting, like I might forget it. So I just like want to put something down. But usually what I do is I have a basic sense of the feature. And once I have something, like I have an understanding of where it's going, like, okay, these are the APIs I'm going to use. This is the repository that I'm going to use. And I have that a sense of like how my view model and my activity or whatever are interacting. Then immediately it takes me a good half a day, like again, for the setup, right? So like I definitely set up my tests and make sure that I have them written down, at least for the portions that I've written the feature. And what I've noticed is once I have that working, then every time I layer in more business cases or I add more features, it becomes easier for me to actually start with the tests. And I'm not very religious about the TDD aspect of it at all by any means. But what I definitely do is I've tried to force myself to get into the habit where if I notice as I'm talking to like, a product person or designer and they're like, oh, this is another use case, or this is one of those, this is business logic that needs to happen in the screen. Once I have things working like harmoniously, at least like with the walking skeleton, so to speak, in there, then it becomes very easy for me. I was like, oh, what is that test case? Okay, so then actually what I do is I drop into my tests. I actually write it out. I write the test case. I don't even, meaning, I write the description of it, like, the whole given when then thing. I plop that in there and I just like keep that as like, my mental model of, okay, this needs to happen. And then I actually go back, write the code, and then come back and write the test. So it's not exactly TDD per se, but it's in that vein where I feel I definitely put it down as a test. So I know that has to go in before, like, I commit to put it up as a PR to mainline. I know that, okay, there's that bit of code that describes the test that needs to get flushed out. So that's worked out pretty well for me. So I'm not very religious by any means when it comes to TDD.
One of the questions I think that gets asked quite a bit is what's the big difference between different types of testing that are out there? Is what am I going to go with? Is it a UI test, or am I going to write a unit test or an integration test? Do you have any input on how you would explain that to a fellow coworker, or maybe someone who's just getting into testing so they can kind of wrap their head around it, maybe where they should start?
Sure. I think the testing pyramid is always a fun one on Android, because I think The concept probably came from, again, I'm guessing web development or maybe even earlier, and it's sort of we're trying to fit it in, with the lingo, and it's not always working. For me, the clear separation is on Android is the JVM unit tests that are independent of the Android platform. So you want most of your business logic to live in pure Kotlin classes that you can test without any Android dependencies. So that's level kind of the lowest level of the pyramid. And then the next level for me is what I would call on-device unit tests. So these are headless tests that need the Android environment. And this gets into an interesting topic of whether you want to use Roboelectric or not to drive that. We can discuss that. The next level after that is what I would call maybe, and I've seen some of the Android docs that I was just reading, a UI unit test. So I call this a targeted and hermetic unit test that just tests a single screen, or maybe at most two screens. And just making sure that that screen is wired up properly, can display the data and not crash when you launch it. And maybe you do a few simple interactions. And then after that, you move up the pyramid and you end up with end-to-end tests. And whether that that looks like a record and replay for you, and you stub out the network, or you're actually hitting the network. Both are possible there. And then maybe at the very top level, there's some specialty tests that are something like performance tests. Although I think performance tests can also they can go they also can go at the unit test level if you're trying to really isolate the performance of a single component. So that's my quick run through the Android the way that I think about the test pyramid on Android.
No, I like that. I guess that's the other big thing I've found for the most part. Like it's you called out the using instrumentation versus not using instrumentation. I think a lot of arguments that I see online, either like on Stack Overflow or Reddit or like Twitter, is people arguing like, oh, UI tests versus integration tests. And in the land of mobile, like, yes, there is that differentiation, but really what matters for us, I think practically, at least what has mattered to me, is like that differentiation between instrumentation and like non-instrumentation tests, right? And beyond that, it honestly, I know it's not a very popular opinion, but beyond that, it doesn't really matter, right? You categorize your tests in those two buckets. And like you rightly said, you want to try and get as much into the non-instrumentation bucket, especially the business logic and the use cases that don't have any Android dependencies. And it's totally fine to have like a bucket of like a bunch of tests in that other bucket, right? Where you have, where you need like the mobile, you need some aspect of like how the mobile platform works to run those tests.
Yeah, I think, again, I would say on Android, those are fairly cheap to run with Flank and Firebase Test Lab or any other sort of testing labs. I don't really recommend. We haven't been having this sort of conversation, at least at Slack, of should we be moving more tests away from instrumentation land. It's really kind of not a big problem right now.
And so that's like actually a good segue. I think one of the things I usually love to hear about when I'm talking to different companies is like, what exactly is your testing setup? I know you gave us a lot of good information about how it goes, but like at Slack, can you tell us a little more about like the setup that you have going in Slack? Like, how many tests do you have? What kind of testing do you do? Like, is there anything that you like to call out that you guys do differently besides what you mentioned?
Yeah, there's a few things. I would say we're fairly traditional. I like to think maybe one differentiator is that as I said, I'm a big believer in the fact that in blocking PR checks. And I have stated this in this way, that I think that, and also developers writing tests, that if we're going to continuously run any tests, they must run as a blocking PR check. So that means that even our end-to-end tests, even though they are considerably more flaky, unfortunately, than all the other tests we have, run as blocking PR checks. And the reason for that is I've been in this industry now since 2005, and I've been sort of adjacent or in testing, test automation my entire career. I have never seen, without a dedicated team, I've never seen a test suite that is not a blocking PR check, and that it not continuously breaking, and someone is like trying to scramble and fix all the sort of the changes that broke that test suite. And I've been in that role myself. I really did not like it. I would really, some people may like it. I don't mind it at all. But I kind of like strongly believe that developers are fully capable of maintaining these test suites, but they need to know that they're going to be breaking them at the PR level. Before they merge and they break it, not after, because once the PR is merged, it is it's gone. Like no one is, a developer, when they hit that merge button, they resolve that Jira ticket. They're moving on. They're going somewhere else. So at least at this Slack scale. So I think that, I'm a strong believer in that, and that means that if we're going to be running all of our tests as a blocking PR check, that absolutely means that the tests must be stable and must execute reasonably fast. So reasonably, let's say within like 30 minutes, like all of your tests, when you submit a PR.
Approximately how many tests do you have like in Slack? I know it means nothing. I know, but this is just purely out of my curiosity. And how long does it take to run those tests?
So we have, let's see, I'm going to give approximate numbers. So I think we have around 10,000 JVM unit tests. We have, I think, roughly 2,000 instrumentation tests, and about, let's say, half of them are UI tests.
Oh, wow.
And half of them are non-UI tests. And then we have around 80, I think it's too many, but we have around 80 end-to-end tests that actually hit a production backend that are running as PR checks. And I gave another DroidCon talk in DroidCon SF around how we do UI testing and how we actually got sort of developers to embrace, not UI testing, end-to-end testing, and how we kind of made it a blocking PR check, which means that it's effectively maintained by the development team. So that's that's our currently our testing pyramid. We used to have a small set of performance tests that ran on every PR. Also, we kind of decided to shut down that pipeline. It became too much of a maintenance cost. So
that is bonkers, by the way.
Really?
In a good way. Like that, yeah. Uh-huh. You mentioned you actually run end-to-end tests that hit production pipelines. How does that work? Because I mean, did you have like a test account or something that's like running on like production API endpoints, and you just have like your Slack messages go in and come out? Is that how it works, or I'm curious?
Yeah, I mean, we've provisioned a large set of test users in a staging environment, and we have our tests kind of randomly pick one of those users. It's not an ideal way. Of course, ideally you would be setting up user and maybe even the entire team or Slack workspace from scratch for every single test. But we had to be pragmatic because we're also dealing with a our staging production environment doesn't allow you to do that in an automated way for good reasons, for security reasons. So we decided, but that we had a trade-off to make. We could have either used a QA environment that was less stable but allowed you to create things on the fly, or we could hit a production environment that was really stable or much more stable, but that doesn't allow you to create state on the fly. And so far, I think that this approach of just provisioning a large set of users and having tests pick one user at random, so far it hasn't bit us, and we haven't reached the scale where we're dealing with problems due to that. But I think here's the thing about end-to-end testing. I think that you have to be really strict about keeping the number of tests small. I think that, for example, 80 tests for us is too large. I think we should be working towards scaling that down to maybe 25 really important use cases that just have to always work, and making those tests super reliable, as much as reliable as they can be. A lot of our problems with end-to-end testing, for example, are mostly around backend. The backend APIs are flaky and, maybe certain use cases are not working, we actually detect some incidents, using our Android end-to-end tests. So that's kind of interesting. We see it coming before the incident is even called.
Oh wow, that's I guess testament to something working. I guess, right?
Yeah, there's a lot of challenges there with end-to-end testing. I can talk more about that if you're interested. But I would recommend, that's kind of like, I would say, an advanced layer that you want to build later after you have all your other bits and pieces in place.
No, I think that makes perfect sense. I like that idea in general, and we'll make sure we try to pick a lot of the links that you mentioned, especially to the talks that you've given on these subjects. We'll make sure to add them in the resources as well.
Sure.
This was awesome. Wow. Yeah, testing is one of those evergreen topics, right? You feel like you've done a lot of things, but then you talk to someone like Valera, and then you realize, wow, there's a lot of interesting stuff that you can still do, and there's so much there's a long ways to go. As always with testing, right? It's one of those things where you can always make it better. It doesn't seem to ever hit a point where you're like, okay, I'm good. I think we're good with how we have our tests going. Thank you for sharing all of this today.
Thank you.
And I think, I'm also really excited about the state of testing with Compose. I think that there's a real opportunity there to make things significantly even better than they are right now.
Have you been following that at all? I'm curious, in terms of how Jetpack Compose is. Okay, awesome. And you have good things to say?
I haven't, so I'll caveat this. I haven't actually gone ahead and written tests with the Compose sort of framework. I read the testing guide, and I some of the things give me hope. Some of the bits and pieces that I've read in that guide, it's fairly small, give me hope that the team has sort of provided synchronization for the test framework out of the box. Espresso had to do some really gnarly things with private APIs and just hijacking the main thread that I hope that the Compose test framework doesn't have to do, because they just built it from scratch, with testing in mind. And I do have it I have a list of notes that I actually wanted to sort of think with the Compose team about, just to ask questions and maybe provide some little bit of feedback. But there is the Compose testing guide. It's already in the Android documentation. I encourage everyone to kind of start looking at it, maybe play around with it and provide feedback to the team, because it's, I believe it's currently in the alpha stages. So there's still opportunity to change things.
This is great. Thank you so much for sharing all of this stuff. We'll make sure to add links in the show notes to all the stuff that you've mentioned. Thanks for taking the time and sharing your thoughts today. This is super useful for us.
Yeah, thank you very much.
I love talking about testing. So anytime, and thanks for inviting me.
Our pleasure. Any parting thoughts before we wind this episode down with respect to testing? Do you have any sage advice for our young developers out there who young in terms of testing?
I do have one thought that I really believe that it's a very we see it time and time again. It's a very important area. It's not an afterthought. I think that testing, maybe test automation, gets sort of this reputation that it's kind of a lower level of engineering. And I would encourage the people that are starting out to really kind of shift that mindset and really try to focus on it and master it early. It's going to really set you up for kind of success in your career.
It's good advice. Good advice.
Definitely.
If folks wanted to reach out to you or just find out more about testing, or if they had specific questions or follow up from this episode, what would be a good way to reach you?
I'm on Twitter. And always open to having a discussion there.
And we'll make sure to add a link to that. Don, if you wanted to share your thoughts on testing, or if people want to get a hold of you, what's a good place to do that?
Same. Best place is Twitter. And what about you, if folks want to get a hold of you?
Same, Twitter. We're all on Twitter, and we'll make sure to add links to our user handles or usernames, and folks can reach out to us.
Thanks again for joining the show.
All right, thank you.
We will catch you folks in the next episode. That's it for the show, folks. Fragmented is hosted by Don Felker and me, Kaushik Gopal. We edit and produce all the episodes here on Fragmented. You can find more Fragmented episodes at fragmentedpodcast.com. Thanks for listening, and we will catch you in the next episode.